Hello and welcome to the Republic of Azo. I am your host, Zach Yost. Today I am so excited to bring you our guest, Jason Jewell. Jason chairs the Department of Humanities at Faulkner University, where he also directs the Center for Great Books and Human Flourishing. He is the editor of the Christian Libertarian Review, a faculty member at Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom, and an associated scholar of the Mises Institute. Our discussion today covers everything from C.S. Lewis and objective value to large families and the role of the family as an important institution in society. So let's get into it. Hey, Jason, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to be here.
So for listeners who aren't super familiar with Jason or his work, I've known him for a long time. I think we met in 2017 at the Mises Institute, I think. And he's always very interesting to chat with because he has his finger on the pulse of both the libertarian world and conservative circles. And that's what we're going to be talking about some today. So earlier this year, Jason, you gave a really phenomenal talk, in my view, at a Mises Institute event on the persistent problem of objective value and sort of squaring economic subjective value with objective value and some places where that runs into trouble. And more recently, you were at the NatCon event and you were on a panel there talking about Fusionism, and I think you specifically were talking about Russell Kirk. So I just want to dive in today and talk about the state of Fusionism, as it were, and what you see happening in the future. So why don't you just tell us real quick what the gist of your talk on objective value was?
Okay, yeah, and thanks for your kind words about the talk. It was a combination of some things that I've just been mulling over for several years, plus some of the relatively recent research that I've done on history of economic thought. But I took the jumping off point of the lecture as C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, which some of your listeners might be familiar with, but is a book version of a series of lectures that he gave during World War II that was a critique of the liberalism of his own time, and particularly the scientific quest to sort of hack humanity and to make human beings, clay in the hands of social engineers, that sort of thing. And so Lewis was warning of the dangers that he foresaw if people continued to go very far down that road. But he launched the series of lectures with this discussion about subjective value. And of course, for economists, subjective value is kind of a given as a descriptive feature of how markets, how we find prices for goods in a free market. Different individuals have different preferences, different priorities, and the intersection of those results in market prices. So that's what an economist means when he talks about subjective value. But when I talk to my own students, I run graduate programs in the humanities, and the students in those programs are coming from a background typically of philosophy or literature or history, something like that. And I will often give them readings to do that are from economists. Sometimes I'll have them read a selection by Ludwig von Mises or Eugen von Bombawerk or some other figure from the Austrian school. If it's something that has a kind of religious angle to it or specifically ethical angle, I might give them something by Sam Gregg, recently of the Acton Institute, now at the American Institute for Economic Research, some more recent figures. And this question of subjective value always comes up. And my students always have this sort of visceral reaction against it if they don't have a background in economics, because when they hear subjective value, they immediately think, oh, that's moral relativism. If you say that there's this thing as subjective value, what you're really saying is that there are no ethical absolutes or anything like that, which of course is not the position of a figure like Murray Rothbard or many of the other great libertarian and conservative thinkers. So I kind of have to walk them through that, but it remains a problem for them because they all want to have some sort of idea of, particularly if they're interested in political philosophy or something like that, they always want to have some kind of application for, you know, what can we do, particularly if they're influenced by a figure like Aristotle, who sees the goal of politics as to encourage virtue in the citizenry, in the populace. And if you have some notion of subjective value and the simply the fact that we all have these different preferences, and if you're living in a pluralistic society, which we all do, we don't agree necessarily on what the good life is or how to approach the good, then that raises all kinds of questions of how do we do politics? How do we live life in common with people who are different from us? So my talk was titled "The Persistent Problem of Objective Value" because I was advocating the notion that there is such a thing as objective value. If we move outside the domain of economics and the descriptive way in which we reach market prices, you know, I'm very much of the view that there are absolute ethical values and objective value that, and since I'm a Christian, I view that through the lens of you know, the teachings of Christianity, and the classical influence on me, you know, leads me to endorse the Platonic notions of the true, the good, and the beautiful, those sorts of things. So my talk was really trying to figure out how can we sort of navigate that when we are wanting to advocate and uphold objective value in the ethical sphere, in the religious sphere, the aesthetic sphere, but also operating within a marketplace with others who do not share those same convictions. And of course, our view is that they have insufficiently, you know, apprehended the reality of these ethical absolutes. But is violence the way to try to bring them around? Of course, the answer to that, from a libertarian perspective, is no. You've got to try to attack that question in different ways. But that leads, of course, to this question of the relationship between conservatives and libertarians, because many conservatives would say, yeah, it's an appropriate role of the political order of the state to sort of advocate that vision of the good and promote that positively, and then also negatively penalize in one way or another those who deviate from it or who take action that is, you know, at odds with that vision of the good. And you see this, I think, in our current moment most clearly with people like the Catholic integralists, the Sohrab-Ahmaris and Adrian Vermeules and people like that, who are just outright advocating for some kind of confessional state.
Yeah.
And the political order that will advance this notion of what they consider to be the common good. And of course, I differ from those guys in that respect. There are other conservatives who wouldn't go necessarily as far as those integralists, but would still say the state does need to play a positive role to bring about, you know, what the Apostle Paul says in Romans 13, that God has put the magistrate, the civil magistrate on earth to punish the wicked and to praise the good. And so one of the themes at this most recent National Conservatism Conference in Miami was this question of particularly there were Protestant panels and there were Catholic panels, but they were both talking about this question of what's the particularly Protestant vision of a state that punishes the wicked and praises the good, or what's the particularly Catholic vision for that. So there was a lot of interesting conversation going on, and those of us, and I wasn't the only person there who was of a more libertarian persuasion. I initially registered for the conference to sort of do recon. This was before I was even asked to speak. I just wanted to go down there and see what this national conservatism thing was all about. And then after I was already registered for the conference, I was invited to participate on this panel that dealt with fusionism. So I'll say more about that in a minute. But when I got down there, there were a number of other people there who I had met at other conferences who I knew to be either libertarians or classical liberals, who were sort of there for the same reasons that I had originally registered for. They were trying to figure out what was going on with this group of people, try to get their finger on the pulse of whatever was happening, and try to figure out to what extent there was constructive dialogue to be had between libertarians and this group of national conservatives. You can go to the statement of principles that this group, the National Conservatives, have published. They originally published it back on the American Conservative magazine's website earlier in 2022, and then I think you can go to the National Conservatives website and find it there again. And I think if you look at that, looking at it from a libertarian perspective, if you are of for like a culturally conservative persuasion like I am, or religiously conservative persuasion, there's a lot of overlap of concern between libertarians like me and the national conservatives. And I was looking at that and thinking a lot of this, I could get on board with whatever they said their agenda was. Of course, the devil's in the details about how exactly they want to implement some of their vision, and that's not all spelled out in much detail in that statement of principles. But I went down there thinking, there's probably some constructive dialogue to be had, and I came away from the conference still thinking that there were a handful of talks that I've either witnessed or heard about because they had breakout sessions, multiple things going on at the same time. I couldn't listen to every talk, but there were a handful of talks where I thought these people are completely crazy, and others that I thought this is somebody that I think I could have a good dialogue with, and others that I just thought, yeah, I fully endorse what this person is saying. So it's kind of a mixed bag in that respect, but I came away kind of hopeful that there was still good progress that could be made on conversations, and not everybody thought that. So there were some people who were eager to bash libertarians, but when they did that, it always seemed to be the libertarianism that they were attacking was kind of a left libertarianism, which I don't agree with anyway. And this is one of the problems with libertarians when it comes to these kinds of conversations, is that libertarianism is a means, it's not an end. Like, you can advance different visions of the good society through libertarian means, but so you might have people who are radically different from me culturally. Still, I could agree with them that even though we want to see society go in different directions, we shouldn't try to advance that primarily through state action. So I've kind of rambled a bit, and I want to give you the opportunity to come back and just ask some more specific questions about either of these things.
Yes. You hit exactly what I wanted to talk about, which was libertarianism as a label is so unhelpful a lot of times, especially when it comes to sort of these ecumenical dialogues. I recall a few months ago there was some ISI conference, and someone got on stage and was like, libertarianism is a philosophy for idiots or something. And there is such a vast array of people who either have the libertarian label applied to them or use it themselves. And one definition that I always think of as being like so distinct and different from my own, but that what a lot of people associate with it, is from the 2008 piece, The Libertarian Moment, by Nick Gillespie and Matt Welsh, where they say, "We are in fact living at the cusp of what should be called the libertarian moment, the dawning not of some fabled, cliched, and loosey-goosey age of Aquarius, but a time of increasingly hyper individualized, hyper expanded choice over every aspect of our lives, from life-saving pharmaceuticals to online dating services. This is now a world where it's more possible than ever to live your life on your own terms. And I suppose when I first became a libertarian in high school, that appealed to me a lot, that definition of libertarianism. But now, you know, to me, this is like, I'm like, eek, that's sort of not good. And I could sort of would argue that mindset is contributing to a lot of our social problems, and that more libertarianism or liberalism, sort of from a Misesian perspective, is about preserving the social order so that we can live in peace and things like that. And it does seem that the vast array of libertarians is so almost incoherent that any criticism against libertarians will fit somewhere, I suppose.
Right. That's that particular explanation of, or that particular definition of libertarianism that's offered by Nick Gillespie in that piece you just quoted. You know, Gillespie has been saying that for a long time. You know, I first became acquainted with libertarianism and Reason magazine in particular, and Gillespie probably a little more than 20 years ago when I was in graduate school. And from the get-go, I noticed that there was this argument over definition. And the reason folks, and Gillespie in particular, will always say libertarianism is about maximizing individual choice. Well, that's never the definition of libertarianism that I have sort of accepted and advocated for. Mine has always been more along the Murray Rothbard lines of the non-aggression principle and the idea that it's perfectly legitimate for individual choice to be constrained within social institutions, within families and churches and voluntary associations of various kinds, that it's not an unalloyed social good for everybody to be able to act on their
Yeah.
their whim or their impulse, you know, at any given moment. That's certainly not conducive to a healthy society. And I think that the more that becomes the more this idea of maximizing individual choice becomes the definition that's broadly accepted of libertarianism, the less it's going to resonate with me, certainly. I'm much more comfortable with the idea that libertarianism does not entail cultural commitments specifically. It is a political philosophy that is about the use of force in society, when and force is justified and when it's not justified. So that's the, and I don't remember exactly the year in which this terminology of thin libertarianism and thick libertarianism started cropping up, but that would be more of the thin libertarianism definition, I guess. In the panel that I participated in at NatCon about fusionism, it was explicitly stated during Q&A by Paul Gottfried in particular that, and by myself and Dan McCarthy as well, that the national conservative people could probably have a lot of good conversations and cooperation with the thin libertarians, the people who are skeptical of the use of government power to achieve ends, but are open to these kind of, you know, conservative cultural commitments. But the so-called, you know, whether you want to call them the Beltway libertarians or the, up until recently, the kind of the cultural posture of the National Libertarian Party, or, you know, maybe the Reason folks as well, there wouldn't be that much of a potential for good cooperation between those kinds of libertarians and the national conservatives. Now, I don't want to paint all those groups with a broad brush. I know and value people who are associated with those various institutions and organizations, but it does seem like on the whole, they take a more culturally left position on a lot of questions that ultimately I don't think is very healthy.
Right, right. And it sort of seems, in my view, and of course there's degrees, on the national conservative side, which I don't think that Sorb Amari likes NatCon anymore. It's hard to keep up with all of his feuding. But the integralists are like way out there extreme. But even people at NatCon itself are more, um, they think these social institutions like the family, marriage, things like that are very important, but they have a very different view from me in terms of the role of the state in propping all of that sort of stuff up. Whereas on the libertarian side, even libertarians who are not libertine hedonists, as it were, seem to sometimes be really missing the picture when it comes to the importance of things like family or religion, and reduce it down to just this, it's just a hyper individualized choice one can make. Oh, you've joined the church. Oh, you have a family. You're married, divorced. It's all just individual choice you make. And on the libertarian side, I mean, this is not an original insight to me, but people point out that so many big names in libertarianism never had children. Mises did not have his own children. Ayn Rand never had children. Murray Rothbard never had children. And I find it quite interesting that Hayek did have children. And he's a very, I would argue, very Burkean in his sort of outlook on society and all that. So do you think there is a potential for more sort of a meeting in the middle of both sides learning from each other, as it were, that if the government is propping up the family, well, the family is just subservient to the government. It's not its own actual institution with social power that is a helpful balancer within society. And libertarians can learn, these social like that individualism in the sort of radical sense is not necessarily conducive to a healthy society, as it were, and that these institutions are important in a collective sense, I guess.
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. I hope there is. There's a lot to unpack in what you were just talking about, and I'm hoping I can go back and like pick up several of the threads that occurred to me while you were speaking just then. I think the conservative critics of markets have a point when they will say things like, the free market can often be seen as, kind of in opposition to the family, in the sense that, the interest of an employer is to have an employee who's fully committed to the business, to the corporation, or whatever it might be, and will put everything to the side in order to, advance, and make sure that the business has maximizing profits or what have you. And if you don't have a cultural commitment on the part of business entities to preserving that space for the family or for other voluntary associations that make for a healthy society, then you can wind up in a very bad place with the atomized individuals and so on. And I think this is really the big problem that we're sort of facing now, particularly now that the sort of the logic of, and I'm not sure what exactly the right vocabulary to use here is. I don't like the whole business of neoliberalism and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. I think that's kind of silly. But the idea of viewing everything in terms of commercial transaction or opportunity cost as relate to commercial transactions. When people talk about, oh, your opportunity cost of having a child is $500,000 or something like that. Well, maybe that's true, but when everything gets reduced to that kind of calculation, then I think you wind up in a bad place. So this is the problem, and I mentioned this in my NatCon talk. that someone like Russell Kirk is looking back to a time when you have people participating in society primarily through the vehicle of these voluntary associations, or what in older time would have been called mediating institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And the modern political theorist wants to see everything in terms of individuals and the state. Like those are the only two things that matter. But this older vision, which I think is a healthier vision in many ways, is that the state doesn't really interact with individuals directly most of the time. If it wants to get to an individual, it has to go through these mediating institutions. It has to go through a household, or it has to go through a trade association,
Yep.
or a church, or something like that. And so the state would be interacting primarily with those corporate entities, and the individual is not like left naked confronting the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the whole so much of the theorizing and so much of the discussion that has gone on within libertarian circles over the last 50 years has sort of taken that naked individual confronting the state as the starting point. But
Yeah.
I think a healthier vision of society wouldn't even get to that point. So you would have to, Robert Nisbet, some of your viewers may be familiar with him and his classic book, The Quest for Community, had a passage in that book in which he talks about the need for a new laissez-faire of associations.
Mm-hmm.
And Kirk endorsed that passage. He quoted from it in his own writing and said, yes, this is what we need, where it's these associations that are really the bread and butter of civic life and social interaction among people. And those associations have kind of a broad autonomy and a scope of action that they can discipline the members of their own organizations in various ways, and the state isn't always coming in and trying to tell those associations what they can and can't do, which of course is the problem that we have right now. I mean, as we're recording this, we're hearing about this court case involving Yeshiva University.
Oh, right. Yes.
Where the university didn't want to approve this LGBT club that some students had tried to propose, but on the grounds that it's not consistent with the mission of the institution and the religious identity and so on. And then the state's coming in and say, no, you have to approve this club. And then the response of the university was to abolish all social clubs.
Right.
Now they're trying to work that out. I mean, I think that ultimately the Supreme Court, if it actually gets up to the Supreme Court, which I think it probably will at some point, the signals there are pretty strong that the court will uphold the right of the university to make that judgment about whether admitting that student club is consistent with its own mission. But as long as the state is getting in between those relations, then I think we're going to continue to have a big problem. But libertarians have got to come to grips with this question of associations and the role that they play. Somebody like Deirdre McCloskey, and I've assigned McCloskey's book Bourgeois Virtues to some of my grad students. We've had a lot of very productive discussions about it. But McCloskey sort of like comes right out in favor of this idea of an individual having many very thin connections with other people and with institutions and associations. McCloskey is advancing this idea of sort of the sovereign individual. That's kind of the vibe you get. I don't think those exact words are used, but the individual who has many very thin connections and associations. And for somebody who is sort of like an upper middle income person who has a lot of social capital pre-existing that they can fall back on or whatever, that might work very well. But for most people, I think you need to have a smaller number of thick associations, and that is inevitably going to constrain the individual in a number of ways. It imposes certain obligations and duties on people within either the nuclear family or the extended family, within a church, a parish, um, maybe a handful of civic organizations, or a union or something like that, where that demand a lot from the members, but that also help to shape those people and help to form them into better citizens, better participants in the community. There's Yuval Levin at the American Enterprise Institute. Obviously, he's not a libertarian, but his recent book from a couple of years ago on the importance of institutions, I think is very significant. I got a lot out of reading that book. And one of the big problems we have today is people using institutions as platforms to advance their own individual brands, rather than viewing the institutions as formative things that help to shape their members. And so churches and universities and the profession of journalism and government and all these other things have kind of been corrupted to an extent, because people want to use those, they want to leverage the power of the institution to enhance their own personal brand, rather than going in to try to help advance the institution's mission and allowing the institution to form them into better people in the process. So that's the kind of thinking about society and about culture that I just think in general libertarians aren't very good at, because they're laser focused on what are the problems that the state is causing and how can we remove those problems or ameliorate them by reducing state influence in whatever the area of life is. So obviously you can get a lot of mileage out of that kind of critique, and I think we need that critique. I think the National Conservatives could use some more of that critique in certain ways. But if libertarians, if that's all they're going to talk about, then they're going to be missing the boat on a lot of these other important social and cultural questions. And I can understand why the people who have maybe a more holistic vision of a way to advance an agenda are going to get very frustrated with libertarians. That seemed to be the attitude of a number of the people that I talked to at the National Conservatism Conference, and you see that also with a number of other groups that are kind of more traditionalist in their orientation, or even on the side of the left, people who have that kind of sensitivity to those cultural questions or social questions. They don't just want to talk about the state.
Right.
Often, of course, their solution is, well, the state can solve this problem by adding a new program or something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, that's going down a wrong direction as well. But
yeah, Father Mike Schmidt, who you've probably are familiar with, he says several times, excuse me, that like the theme song of Hell is Frank Sinatra's song, I Did It My Way. And in a way, that's also the libertarian anthem, it seems. And even even some thin libertarians who aren't necessarily in favor of libertinism, to them, they think all public morality is, the NAP, basically, the non-aggression principle. And we can't even comment on, public morality outside of aggression. And recently I've been
or if you say something like, you hear libertarians say this too, like, let's say a devout Catholic who says, well, I need to do my best to conform my own thinking to the Catholic Church's teaching on various things. And you'll hear people say, well, that's not very libertarian of you. It's like, well, that has nothing to do with libertarianism if you're thinking about it the way that, that I think is the healthy way to think about it with the non-aggression principle. So I get what you're saying there. That's definitely a problem that you run into a lot among people kind of in our camp, I guess.
Yeah, and it seems to be a broader problem in culture overall. Is just this, and I mean, even in myself, I definitely see it, like just this disinclination to submit one's will. And recently recently I was sick, and so rather than doing anything productive, I was just like binge watching and researching about Amish people. And I live in Western Pennsylvania, so when I venture into the country, I mean, I drive around their buggies, and my family has done business with Amish businesses and stuff. But it is truly fascinating in some way. The Amish are like, in a sense, the ideal libertarians in that they like take no government handouts, they mutual aid, etc., etc. And they're also pacifists. And so many libertarians cannot stand the Amish. I mean, I remember when I was a college activist, I was at, a meeting, and several libertarians, who I guess you'd call left libertarians, were like, part of the mission of libertarianism needs to be like to liberate the Amish because they're patriarchal and oppress women and all this stuff. And it's like the Amish, I mean, they have such a high retention rate and everything. They seem to have nailed down submitting themselves, which is so foreign to everyone today, even people who want to do it.
And that kind of rhetoric that you were hearing on your college campus is the reason why somebody like Russell Kirk just says, well, libertarians are leftists. I mean, that's all there is to it. When you come along and you say we have to liberate the individual from every social institution that might constrain the exercise of the individual will, I mean, that is leftism in the modern sense. So that's, again, not the libertarian vision that I was first attracted to. When I came to read the libertarian thinkers, again, about 20 years ago, sort of the sine qua non for me was, well, is this consistent with Christianity and with submission to God first and foremost, but also in whatever authority that God has placed in your life, whether it's a parent or an employer within certain bounds, or the leadership of the church. And I wasn't really going to have much patience with some political philosophy that tried to extend into those social relationships as well. And I was glad to see that the libertarian thinkers that I was reading said, yeah, that's all sort of in the domain of society, like the separation of state and society, or that dichotomy that people like Rothbard would talk about. All those relationships of within the church or the family, that's all society, and we're just talking about the state here when we're making these criticisms of this unjust authority. So that's definitely something that I think that kind of let's liberate the individual from all these oppressive institutions is that way of thinking is very far advanced, of course. But the irony then, obviously, which you're well aware, is that you quote unquote liberate these people from their families and from their churches and from their communities, local communities and norms and all that. And you have to have the state take on a much larger role, because there has to be governance. There has to be governance in society. And if it's not going to be through those mediating institutions, then the state will do it. And however much you want to like live in some kind of Randian fantasy, that, I mean, let's say you do set up, well, you notice when you read Atlas Shrugged that there's all these people in Galt's Gulch and only one woman who has children. That society will die, And going back to your earlier point about these leading lights of libertarianism not having children and not paying attention to that crucial question of how do we preserve and perpetuate civilization, then no matter how great your thinking about individual liberty is, it's all going to go away in a generation if you haven't figured out that crucial question.
Right. And this is sort of a good opportunity to pivot a little bit, because you know a lot about that. You have a large family yourself. I think you have 7 kids, right?
That's right.
Yeah, that's about the average size of an Amish family. And so it just seems to me, I mean, I'm a millennial. I just turned 29. It's like a historical aberration that I'm not married yet, but it's completely normal for people of my generation. And I mean, I think millennials are on track to just completely break the historical pattern of having children. It's going to be a very, very large number of childless people who may or may not get married later in life. And part of that, it seems that there's almost this, you mentioned there was that study that everyone was arguing about on Twitter, like, oh, the opportunity cost of having a child. It almost seems that we've created a culture of, if not flat out childlessness, of not many kids. I mean, I think you've told funny stories on social media where people are like, you have 7 kids? Like, wow, are you a nut job or something? You know? So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on like what it is to be so out of step, I guess, with the times, and what challenges there have been, and also what good things have been from having a large family.
Yeah, it's a big question, a big topic. I could go on about it for a long, long time, probably longer than we have time for here. But the trends that you alluded to just now are very real. I think the stats that I have seen are something like, if the trends continue, if they hold, then probably a quarter of millennial women will never have children. That's a really, when you think of like historically on average, um, every woman has had at least one child, then that's something that is definitely a break with historic norms. And the average age of marriage has risen dramatically. I think the average age of marriage in the millennial generation is around 30.
Yeah.
So you still got time to beat the average, Zach, if you. But I got married at age 26, and I thought that I was getting married kind of late.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a Christian college in which many of my friends were finding their future spouses there at college and getting married either during their school years or immediately after. In the mid 90s, I was probably in 7 or 8 weddings as a groomsman. So I felt kind of behind the curve on that. And then I did get married at age 26, as I said, but we didn't have our first child until 29. So again, that's historically, that's kind of late for people not to have children. Of course, the longer you wait to have children, the more difficult it gets, particularly for the women, even though that doesn't seem to be a very widely known fact either. So I think there's been a cultural narrative that is deceiving a lot of people of your generation that says, well, you go have fun in your 20s and live life, and then by the time you get to your 30s, that's when it's time to get serious and settle down and start a family and all of that. But particularly for women, you wait until your 30s and you're already past the kind of sweet spot biologically where it's the easiest to have children.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got this narrative of you're selling your youth if you get married young and have children in your 20s, which I think is just a poisonous message culturally. But at any rate, we didn't, as I said, we didn't have our first child until I was 29. I think my wife was 28 when we had our first, and then we had 7. So we were having kids well into our 40s, and I've done the math, and we're not going to be empty nesters probably until I'm in my mid 60s. So I've got a long way to go. We have a 5-year-old in the house right now,
Yeah.
and we have a long way to go. But it's just become life for us. It's normal for adults to have children living with them. Historically, that is how things work. And for this to be painted as some kind of huge sacrifice that you're making, I mean, on one level it is, because you can go play games and have fun and not grow up. You can be Peter Pan, I guess, if you want to not have children either until you're in your 30s or your whole life, I guess. But there are a number of powerful reasons why I think people should have children. On the big picture, of course, there is this question, this very basic question of perpetuating civilization. When fertility is at an all-time low, that's going to mean major cultural and social and economic challenges for our society. And you hear people try to wave that away and say, oh, well, we can just let in more immigrants or something like that. And on one level, yeah, you can do that. But whenever you have large scale immigration, it changes the society, it changes the culture. And if you think that we have a kind of a good thing going more or less in Western civilization, risking that, you're really rolling the dice if you just say, we'll fix these demographic problems by importing, like the only place in the world really right now that has above replacement level fertility is sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you want to kind of roll the dice culturally and import a lot of people, and I know a lot of people from sub-Saharan Africa, and I really like them, and I think they're great people, but that's going to be a massive cultural shift if that's who you're counting on to pay your Social Security when you're old or something like that. Now I completely recognize that's not a concern that's going to motivate a lot of 20-year-olds, people in their 20s, like, who's going to pay my Social Security when I'm in my 60s? But I think there's also, and this is coming from a more kind of religious angle as well, that I can just tell in my own life, and I know from talking to many other people who are parents, that it's having that first child that significantly reorients your thinking and makes you a much less selfish person. That happens to some extent when you get married. It did for me. I had to recognize, I'm in my mid-20s, I'm committing my life to this other person, and now my life isn't just about fulfilling my own goals and doing my own thing. There's another person in the picture. Even so, my wife, of course, she's a mature adult independent person as well, and had we never gotten married, we both would have been able to do our own thing. But when you have a child and that person is utterly dependent on you, you leave that person alone to his own devices and he will die. That's just all there is to it. And so the obligation that you take on in having a child, yes, it's a constraint on you. Yes, you don't get to go out as often. You don't get to take as many vacations or go to the opera or the movies as much maybe now. And so, yeah, you are giving something up, but you're also becoming a better person by learning to subordinate your own will to the needs of this person who's dependent on you. And I think that the fewer people that we have in our society who are going through that experience, the more social dysfunction we're eventually going to see when we have a larger and larger percentage of the society that has not been disciplined or formed in that way. So again, I'm kind of talking like to an extent kind of large scale social questions that libertarians typically don't think about.
Right.
But they're very real considerations. But having the child has the potential to make you a much better person individually. And so it's something that I think we're losing out on a lot, both individually and socially, if fewer people are going down that road. Now, the big sacrifice, of course, the biggest sacrifice, if you want to think of it that way, comes with the first child. But there are economies of scale with having children, like in many other areas of life. And we were at one point living in a 1,000 square foot house with 6 boys sharing a bedroom, and we made it work for a couple of years while we were, working some things out financially. But people talk like it's this huge financial burden to have a child, and there's a sense in which that's true if you think about the opportunity cost of not having both people working and all of that. Yeah, that's all true. But I think it's not as big of a cost as a lot of people think it is, particularly if you are able to resist some of the cultural pressure to lavish all kinds of things on those children, buying them new clothes every year and all that kind of thing. Like,
Right.
We've had so many people from church and other folks just out of nowhere just walk up to us and say, here's a big bag of clothes that our 8-year-old can't wear anymore, and I know you have a 7-year-old who will probably be able to wear these shortly. And so when you're embedded in a community, you can, reap the benefits of that in those various ways. So I encourage people, who are thinking about having children to, yes, do it. It's a life-changing thing. It's scary, but it's also something that will make you a better person, and you'll be contributing to society in a very significant and meaningful way.
Yeah, I think with that, everyone say, "Oh, it's like so expensive and everything." I think Michael Brennan Doherty, who I think was an only child, and his wife comes from a very large family. I recall him saying once that what he sort of fears is that like increasingly less and less people know people with lots of kids, and so I mean, to if someone was an only child and everyone in their entire school was an only child or just had one sibling, like the idea of having 7 kids probably seems sort of crazy. And like personally, what I've thought is like, in the it can be done sort of thing, is my own great great grandfather, who came over from Austria at the end of the 19th century. He had 10 children, and he was a janitor at a Catholic school. I was in the house they grew up in. I think it's smaller than my house now. And, my great grandfather was one of was child 6 or 7 or something. So I'm glad, they decided to have all those kids. And it was like, this is in like the 19 teens and 20s they were being raised. It was much harder than it is now. And it's like, well, they could do it. We could find a way somehow today. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's right. And you even see it today with, particularly among immigrant families.
Mhm.
It's common to see first generation immigrants come in and live in, you know, um, conditions that are probably better than wherever they came from, but wouldn't be up to our standards, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah.
Not shying away from having 4, 5, 6 children, um, and at the same time, you've got, some hand wringing native person who was born here saying, well, I can't afford to have one because it's just too expensive. I mean, we are the wealthiest society in the
Right.
history of the world. And to say that it's too expensive for people to have children is just, I don't know what kind of wavelength these people are on to make that argument. It's certainly not any kind of historically informed
Right.
wavelength. Now, I will say this: if your aspiration is to live in a coastal city where
Yeah.
real estate is sky high and all that kind of thing, then yeah, you're going to be more constrained in that area than you might be otherwise. But in the majority of the country, certainly the majority of the country geographically, um, there's plenty of reasonable housing to be had. We've never had a problem living on one income where we live in flyover country. So even with a large household, so I'm very grateful, and we have been blessed certainly. But my wife has never had to take a job outside the home since I graduated from with my graduate degree, and I recognize that the deck is stacked against millennials in certain ways that it wasn't stacked against me when I was coming onto the job market, 18, 19 years ago. But I still think that it's much more workable than a lot of people recognize to be able to start a family.
Yeah. I mean, if you go back far enough, I mean, hunter gatherers had families. Yeah. So real quick, right before we end, this year you became the editor of the Christian Libertarian Review, and I suspect listeners might be interested in learning about that and what your sort of plans are now that you're in charge and all that, and what kind of stuff you'd be interested in people submitting if they were so inclined.
Yeah, the Christian Libertarian Review is a publication sponsored by the Libertarian Christian Institute, which is run by Norman Horn. Some of your listeners may be familiar with him, and he asked me to take over that publication when the previous editor was moving on to other projects. And so it's an online only publication, but it is open access, so you don't have to pay to subscribe. If you do a search on Christian Libertarian Review, I tend to get the acronym mixed up because it's Christian Libertarian Review, but the Libertarian Christian Institute. I sometimes get them mixed up. But the Christian Libertarian Review does have a website, and you can go back and look at a few years of archives there. And I think that some of the themes that I am hoping to publish articles on are some of the same things that we've been talking about here in our conversation. This question of libertarian engagement with the broader culture in this particular historical moment when we're kind of in a post-Trump landscape now. Populism is a thing. Libertarians have to engage with that. It's okay to critique populism, certainly. It's not the answer to all the problems, certainly. But I do get a little frustrated with some libertarians who just kind of look down their nose at the kind of anti-elitist frustration that a lot of people feel when you've got this political class that has been kind of riding roughshod over a lot of folks in the last several years, particularly with the COVID mandates and all that business. When looking back on the other side of that, I think it's important for Christian libertarians in particular to be able to articulate a positive vision for engagement with the culture and with the political system. I think one of the big questions that some Christians are starting to ask, and this was a theme at the National Conservatism Conference, every society has elites, and our elites stink in this country. There's no question. As a class, there are good ones here and there, I guess you could say. You do have the occasional Ron Paul or what have you. But how are we going to form good elites who will be able to bring about the cultural and the social and the political change that we want? I mean, do libertarians have anything to say about that? Or is it going to be repeating the old, well, we just need to repeal everything, abolish everything? What are you going to replace it with? Certainly the state is doing a lot of things that it ought not to do, but you need to have some kind of replacement ready to go before you can make a plausible case that we can repeal this thing. So that's a concern that I would like to see addressed in the journal. Some of the interesting conversations that are happening are having to do with this kind of reinvigorating local community. Do libertarians have anything to say about that? Scholars like Michael Lind have made some interesting arguments about how we've kind of lost our local elites in this country as the elite class has become nationalized. And that is one of the big reasons why a lot of medium-sized cities, towns, and even some large cities are being left behind economically and culturally. There's no local elite that's kind of looking out for that community and trying to make it competitive in the marketplace of cities, if you want to call it that. Do libertarians have anything to say about that? And then, of course, religious liberty continues to be a really significant issue that libertarians ought to be able to have a lot of good arguments to make. I think particular arguments about proposed legislation, some policy work is needing to be done that can happen in scholarly journals of that kind. So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for a journal like the Christian Libertarian Review to be a constructive part of a conversation there on how to move the ball forward on a lot of the things that are of mutual concern to Christians, by which I have always said, the vision, the Christian component of this journal is going to be if you can say the Nicene Creed without crossing your fingers, then, or if your argument is consistent with someone saying the Nicene Creed without crossing his fingers, then it's welcome for consideration in the journal. But then the libertarian side of things is that we're looking for non-state alternatives to to the questions that are kind of perplexing us right now. So that's the vision that I have for the journal in a nutshell, and I'm way behind on making it happen. I keep on apologizing to Norman that I've had so many things going on professionally this year that it's been hard for me to get the ball rolling on some of that, but I have high hopes that that it's going to start happening very soon.
Great, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think listeners will have a lot to think about too. So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Zach. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Republic of Azo. Be sure to subscribe and check out all the links in the description below. Thanks, and have a great day.